By the time Bob Bowtell realized he could not get back out the way he had gone in, the men above him were looking at a hole in the ground that suddenly was no longer an entrance. It had become a rescue problem. Bowtell was an Australian engineer, a corporal with 3 Field Troop, Royal Australian Engineers. He was working in the Hobo Woods north of Saigon during Operation Crimp in January of 1966. The soldiers on the surface had already learned that the ground under them was not what it looked like. They were finding hidden openings, chambers, narrow passages, stores, papers, equipment. What had first looked like a position to clear was turning into something much larger. But none of that mattered to Bowtell once the passage tightened around him. The tunnel was small enough that turning around was not something a man could count on. Men who went down there sometimes had to keep moving until they found enough room to reverse themselves. That sounds like a minor detail when you say it above ground. Inside a tunnel, it changes the whole job. Your way in and your way out may be the same strip of earth, and if that strip stops working, there is no shoulder of the road to pull onto. There is no room to step aside. There may not even be room to turn your head the way you want. Bowtell moved into one of those passages on January 11th. At some point inside, he became wedged in a very tight opening. One account from the Australian War Memorial describes it as a trapdoor in the floor. Another veteran account remembers an entrance so small that Bowtell could not be pulled free in time. However you picture the exact geometry, the important part is simple. The passage that had admitted a man no longer gave him a usable route back. The men outside could not solve that by telling him to reverse. They had to change the tunnel. That is where this story begins. Because when people talk about tunnel rats, the image that usually survives is a man disappearing into a black hole with a flashlight. The part that gets lost is how quickly the ground itself could take control of the problem. A few inches could decide whether a man could move forward, back up, rotate his shoulders, lift an arm, or be reached by the men behind him. And in Bowtell's case, the men above him were now trying to widen a piece of Vietnam, fast enough to get one corporal back out. Operation Crimp had started only a few days earlier, on January 8th. American and Australian forces went into the Hobo Woods looking for a major Viet Cong headquarters. They found something under the ground that they had badly underestimated. The Australian engineers did not just find isolated hiding holes. They found connected passages, rooms, supplies, and records. Captain Sandy MacGregor and the men of 3 Field Troop began doing something that was still new enough to feel improvised. Instead of simply sealing every tunnel they found, they went inside and tried to understand where it went. That meant the job was partly demolition, partly reconnaissance, partly crawling survey work. And it meant a man underground could become the only set of eyes on a piece of the battlefield. There was very little elegance to it. A flashlight mattered, a pistol mattered, a compass or line could matter. The shape of the tunnel mattered more than almost anything. Ivan Barnett, one of the Australian sappers who later described the work, remembered crawling through passages where a man could not simply turn around. If the tunnel stayed too narrow, you kept going until it opened enough to reverse direction. He remembered passages changing direction, trapdoors appearing, rooms branching away, and the constant problem of never really knowing the full size of what lay below them. That is the map I want you to keep in your head, not the museum version of Coochie, with visitors moving through a prepared section. Think of a working tunnel found during an operation while nobody on the Allied side yet understood the size of the network beneath them. One opening is known. A man goes through it. Then the shape changes. On the surface, the entrance is still right there. Underground, that does not mean the man has a route to it. Bowtell was 33 years old. He was also a bigger man than many of the soldiers who did this work. Later accounts place him around 6 feet tall. That mattered underground in a way it would not have mattered on an ordinary patrol. A passage that a smaller sapper could work through could become a restriction for him. He took his turn anyway. That point is worth holding on to, because these early tunnel searches did not begin with a polished profession called tunnel rat and a long-established handbook. The men were learning what the tunnels demanded while they were already inside them. By January 11th, they had been underground for days. They had also been using smoke and tear gas in connection with the tunnels. The exact sequence and effect in Bowtell's case is described somewhat differently in later accounts, but the broad problem is well documented. Tunnel air could be made worse by smoke and gas, and the Australians had already experienced men being overcome underground during the operation. So when Bowtell became stuck, the problem was not simply that he could not move. Time underground mattered because the environment was not neutral. The first response was the most obvious one. Get him free from the same place. Men tried to reach him. They tried to dig down. They tried to widen the shaft. That sounds straightforward until you remember what they were working through. They were not standing in an open trench with room for picks and shovels on every side. The tunnel had already dictated the angle of approach. The earth above it had to be opened without making the situation worse. The man they were trying to reach was in the same confined space they were trying to enlarge. The route had become the problem, and every attempt to fix that route took time. At some point, a rescue that had been about pulling one man backward became a problem of getting another man forward. Private Jim Daly volunteered to go in after Bowtell. He entered the tunnel repeatedly. The Australian War Memorial account says he went in 4 times. Those trips matter because they show how the geometry was defeating the normal idea of rescue. You could not simply send a group in around Bowtell. There was no room for that. The tunnel admitted rescuers one at a time, and each man who went in had to work inside the same restrictions. Daly kept trying until his own condition became a concern. Eventually, his platoon commander ordered him out. That decision is one of the hardest parts of the story, and it does not need any dramatic language added to it. A man is trapped underground. Another man is still willing to go back. The officer above has to decide when another attempt is becoming another casualty. That is not a decision about courage. It is a decision about what the tunnel will allow. And this is where the story changes. At the beginning, Bowtell's problem is easy to describe. He needs to get back out. By the middle of the rescue, that is no longer the whole problem. Now the men above have to keep the rescue from consuming more men than it saves. The same entrance that gave them access is narrowing their choices. The same tunnel that lets Daly reach Bowtell also exposes Daly to the same bad air and the same lack of working room. The earth does not care that there is a rescue underway. That is what makes underground work so different from the way we tend to imagine combat. Above ground, danger often looks like something you can point at. A tree line, a road, a ridge, a firing position. Down in a tunnel, the physical dimensions of the place can become the threat all by themselves. A shoulder cannot clear a turn. A man cannot rotate. A rescuer cannot get beside the casualty. A shaft cannot be widened quickly enough. Those are not cinematic problems. They are measurements, and measurements do not negotiate. There is another detail from Sandy MacGregor's later recollection that helps explain why the men had so few options. He said that in some of those passages, a man had to continue forward until he reached a section wide enough to turn around. If somebody collapsed or became stuck in a narrow part, pulling him backward could be extremely difficult. Now, put that beside Bowtell's size. Put it beside the smoke and tear gas used in the tunnel system. Put it beside a rescue team that could not crowd into the passage. The story stops being about a fearless man in the dark. It becomes a problem in space. That is a more useful way to understand what these men were actually doing. And if you served around engineers, infantry, or anyone who worked tunnel systems in Vietnam, I would genuinely like to know something specific. When a passage got too tight to turn around, did your unit send the smallest man by habit? Or was it still mostly whoever volunteered? Put the unit and year in the comments if you are comfortable doing that. Those details are the kind that usually disappear from the official summaries. The Australians had arrived at Operation Crimp with no reason to believe they were about to define a whole category of Vietnam War work. They had tools, they had engineers, they had a mission to search and destroy enemy facilities. Then they found a world underneath the operation. Captain MacGregor's men started mapping sections with compasses and line. They found supplies and documents. They found that a tunnel opening could lead to another passage, then another level, then another room. What looked like a hole might be a doorway into a system. That discovery created a new responsibility. If you destroy the entrance without searching it, you may destroy intelligence you never knew existed. If you search it, somebody has to go in. There was no machine that could do the whole job for them in 1966. So a man went. And once a man went underground, the people above had to trust information coming back through a very small opening. That is what Bowtell's accident changed for 3 Field Troop. It forced the men to confront the fact that the person searching the tunnel could become the problem they had to solve. The records do not give us a neat, minute-by-minute transcript of Bowtell's time underground. They do not give us every word passed between him and the men outside. And there is no reason to invent any of that. The documented facts are enough. He went into the tunnel. He became trapped in a confined opening. Men tried to widen the route. Jim Daly repeatedly entered to try to reach him. Daly had to be ordered out before the tunnel took another man. Bowtell did not come back alive. I am not going to stretch that last fact into a scene it does not need. What matters for this story is what happened to the map. When Bowtell crawled in, the entrance represented a route. Once he became wedged, it represented access without recovery. That is a very different thing. And the men of 3 Field Troop understood it, because they had to keep working the tunnels after January 11th. They did not get to turn the entire operation into a memorial service and stop. The tunnels were still there. The mission was still there. The intelligence inside them was still there. The enemy infrastructure was still under their feet. So the practical question after Bowtell was not whether tunnel searching was frightening. It was how to keep doing it with a better understanding of what could go wrong. That is where experience begins to harden into procedure. Size mattered. Air mattered. The ability to reverse direction mattered. How far a man went before the passage widened mattered. What had been pumped into the tunnel before entry mattered. How another man could reach him mattered. The surface party mattered. The job was never just the man with the flashlight. It was the relationship between the man underground and the men who still had room to move. One of the strangest things about Operation Crimp is that even after all this, the Australians were still uncovering more of the system. MacGregor later remembered being disappointed when the unit was finally told to pull out, because another opening appeared to lead to yet another lower level. Think about that. They had been down there for days. They had recovered material. They had suffered casualties from the tunnel environment. They had lost Bowtell. And they still did not have the bottom of the place. That tells you why an exit could become such a serious problem. The men were not crawling through a little backyard shelter with one door. They were entering something whose geometry they did not own. The people who built it knew where passages narrowed. They knew where levels changed. They knew which openings connected. The men searching it were learning one body length at a time. There is a tendency, years later, to compress all of that into a phrase like coochie tunnels, as though everybody knew what those words meant from the beginning. They did not. In January 1966, the scale itself was part of the discovery. The Australians were helping prove that these were not just hiding places. They were infrastructure. That meant there was value in going farther, and every extra foot made the route back more important. I think that is the part of Bowtell's story that stays with me. Not because it is the most dramatic version of tunnel warfare, because it is the most physical. A man does not need to meet an enemy underground for the tunnel to beat his plan. He only needs to reach a piece of it that no longer lets his body do what the plan requires. At first, the plan is enter, search, come back. Then the tunnel says no. Now the plan is free him. The passage says no. Now the plan is widen it. That takes too long. Now the plan is send another man. That man begins to run out of safe working time. Now the officer has to stop the rescue attempt before the tunnel creates a second trapped man. Every change makes the next option worse. That is retention on a screen, maybe. For the men there, it was just Tuesday, January 11th, 1966. There is also something else worth remembering. The term tunnel rat had not yet acquired all the legend that came later. MacGregor called his Australian men tunnel ferrets. The better-known American label came afterward and stuck. That matters, because Bowtell was not stepping into a famous role. He was an engineer doing a job that had just become necessary. No mythology was waiting for him underground. Just dirt, tight dimensions, and a mission that had found a place where ordinary movement stopped working. Later, American units would develop more organized methods for tunnel exploitation. Engineers would build procedures around lessons learned in operations like this one. Tunnel searching became a recognized specialty in Vietnam because the tunnels kept forcing somebody to solve the same basic problem. How do you search a space built specifically to deny you normal movement? But I would be careful about making that sound cleaner than it was. A procedure can reduce uncertainty. It cannot make a tunnel wide. It cannot give you a second exit where there is none. It cannot make two men fit side by side if the passage only admits one. The job always came back to the human body. That is why the memory of these men is so specific when you listen to veterans talk about it. They remember dimensions. They remember turns. They remember not being able to rotate. They remember having to go forward because backward was not practical yet. They remember the opening above them getting farther away. Those are working memories, not speeches. And they tell you more than any dramatic description of darkness ever could. The official histories that came out of Vietnam eventually described tunnels as a serious engineering and tactical problem. Large tunnel systems could include storage areas, command spaces, and other facilities. But in January 1966, 3rd Field Troop was learning that in real time. Bowtell's death was one of the costs of that learning. The Australian War Memorial records the rescue effort plainly. Men tried to dig down and widen the shaft. Jim Daly kept entering. The attempt could not succeed in time. There is no satisfying turn after that. No last-second opening appears. No hidden second route suddenly solves it. That would make a better movie. It would make a worse history. What happened instead is more useful to remember. The entrance stayed where it had always been. Men remained on the surface close enough to know exactly where Bowtell was. And still, the distance between him and open ground had become too difficult to overcome. That is what an underground battlefield can do to distance. 10 feet is not 10 feet anymore. A few feet of earth can become a wall because you cannot attack it from the direction you need. A man can be close enough to hear and still be beyond an easy rescue. A route can exist on a sketch and be unusable to a human body. After Operation Crimp, the significance of tunnel search work was impossible to dismiss. The discoveries made by the Australians helped show Allied commanders how extensive these underground systems could be, and why simply treating each opening as an isolated hole was not enough. That lesson carried forward. So did the names. Robert Walter Bowtell was not an anonymous silhouette disappearing into a tunnel. He was a corporal. He was 33. He was a Royal Australian engineer. He had a wife and children back home. And on January 11th, 1966, he became the man whose route out of a tunnel in the Hobo Woods stopped working. If you are here because you want the Vietnam stories that sit underneath the famous battles, the jobs, the machinery, the men who had to solve the ugly practical problems, subscribe. That is what this channel is trying to preserve, while the people who remember those details can still correct the record. There is one final image I want to leave exactly as simple as the record allows. After Bowtell was recovered, the hole was still there. The same small opening that had let an engineer into the ground remained visible from above. Nothing about it looked large enough to hold a story, but for the men of 3 Field Troop, it no longer meant way in. They had learned that day that a tunnel entrance was only an exit as long as the man inside could still use it.